Good evening, Adam. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, good, good. It's great to span the time zones and span the globe. And Luna, our family sentient being, is chipping in to get us started with the intro already. So, but thank you so much for making the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. It's good to have another conversation.
And thanks for inviting me. I'm really interested in having the chat.
Yeah, it's good to turn the tables because I've obviously been a guest now on a couple of your shows, one with Nick and one with you and Nick on freedom of species on 3CR as well. So it's great to turn things around and have me being the one to ask the questions. So
Absolutely, and I like the scope of topics that we're gonna explore today and that you explore on the show. It's a really nice opportunity to speak in depth about maybe things that we don't often do. Like we don't often talk about these sorts of things, I suppose. They inform so much of who we are, I think, but we don't often take the time to really chat about them.
And that's part of the motivation behind it, because in a way, I've got this obvious bias in this series because I'm trying to normalize and popularize this idea of sentientism, but it's really doing what you're suggesting there. It's sort of going back to the real basics, which I think can be refreshing, but I also think they're the most important questions to ask. And that's why with my, lazy interviewing style, I ask the same questions every time. What's real? What should we believe and how? And what and who matters? So yeah, it's going to be good to dig into your philosophical journey and understand your thoughts about the answers to those big questions and its implications too.
Looking forward to it, no matter how scattered they are.
Let's find out. I think a bit of scattering is healthy. Yeah. But before we get onto those two crazily broad questions, how would you best introduce yourself?
I suppose I'd say that I'm an animal person. I sort of get up and work with animals in mind. Really have tried to situate my life in a way that I can dedicate what I do in my career for animals and at home with my own animals and my own family members, sort of looking after them. I'm a vegan activist, lecturer, and scientist, I suppose, or the few different descriptors that I'd use. And it's been, so I sort of started as a environmentalist and then came across the idea of animals mattering, and that then really took over the way I think about the world and the way I act in the world. And for the last 10 years at least has been a driving force in what I do and what I dedicate myself to, trying to create a better world for animals, the environment, and people, if we can.
Yeah, it's one of those topics that does tend to draw you in once you get it. It's sort of inexorable. Yeah, so it would be good to explore that. Thank you. And so the first of these massive questions is, what's real, or if you like, how to go about believing and how to build knowledge. And so for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up originally in quite a sort of naturalistic, maybe scientifically minded family and context, or one that was more supernatural, mystical, spiritual, maybe, and how their thinking has shifted through the course of their lives about the nature of reality and what and how to believe. So yeah, you can wind the clock back as far as you like, but it'd be fascinating to know your story and where you are now on epistemology.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So I suppose not a very religious family or religious at all. I suppose my grandmother was Catholic, and probably the only connection to religion. My dad was very sort of non-religious and was happy to share that with us and the rest of the kids. And my mum had an estranged relationship with religion, I suppose. She came afoul of religion. Like she had a daughter out of wedlock, and that caused issues in family, and she was really traumatized by the way that the family treated her because of that, and that gave her a very sour taste in her mouth for religion. And
what variety of religious context was that she came from?
It's Catholicism and a one side of the family, Dutch Catholicism. They're very, very very strongly sort of religious, and those sorts of improprieties in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't okay for someone to be doing that sort of thing. She believes there's a higher power there, but she's not invested in Catholicism. But it's never really been a thing that we do or did went to church a few times for family events, maybe with my grandma for Christmas, but mostly not. And then in high school, I was really into atheism, and got on, back in the day, like in the early 2000s, got on a lot of forums and philosophical forums chatting about religion and atheism with folk who are religious, I suppose, and just into had an affinity, I suppose, with science and biology in particular, and really pursued that. But always interested in why people were thinking about the world in the ways they were. So I remember my first year of university, I joined a group that was like they were basically a religious group, and I would go there to have conversations with them. And there was a particular person that became a friend, who was a pastor of one of these born again sort of, they have a band up the front thing, and we'd have a coffee every week, and we'd just sort of discuss and chat about reality and the world. And he was trying to convert me, and it wasn't working, but I was trying to sort of have reasonable conversations with him. So it's always been something I've thought about. But then during university, I got more interested in environmentalism, and I'd sort of settled my thoughts on religion, and wasn't particularly enamored by it. I thought that, it's got some interesting social benefits, I suppose, in some ways, but also social harms. And I can see sort of the social behavioural evolution, perhaps, of where a religious organisation might evolve from. I think that it makes a lot of sense why these sorts of groups do evolve, but it doesn't mean I believe it. Like, I think Richard Dawkins says something like he's agnostic because he's atheist, but he's sort of like, because we can never know. I'm like the other side. I'm proper atheist. I just don't think there's anything there. It's like I know I probably should be, as a scientist, be that little bit of agnostic and
leave the door open a crack.
Leave the door open a crack, but I just it's just not there for me. I'm just not. I just very, very, very much like, I'd be open for it to be proved differently, but I just don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah. And I think I'm in a similar place, because I think, there's a functionally infinite number of things that have no evidence that you could choose to believe in. And why be fill in the blank for all of them? Like, why is atheism any different from a chocolate teapotism, or
Yeah, exactly. The teapot is the one that.
And I did get correct, because I was on another podcast, Clearer Thinking, recently, and I was corrected that apparently my Bayesian probabilistic statistics should be slightly different from the chocolate teapot and a deity, but regardless, they're both in the same ballpark of we're done, right? It's enough there. So
yeah, exactly. And so I suppose what I think, or how I think about reality, is grounded in a natural science, and I think that there are things that are real. I think that there are things that we can know are real, I suppose. How well we know them and what we know about them, I think, is very different. And when it comes to sort of human culture and social understandings about things, I think that becomes more wishy-washy, because they're just thoughts and ideas. And I'm not going to say that certain things are real or not in terms of a socially constructed sort of ideas. But certainly, I think the desk that's in front of me is real, and we can probably prove that, and that science is a very good way to understand the physical world. How we behave and interact in the world, I then think, is structured. We come to that differently. That's a philosophical and ethical question, and I think that science gives us some understandings about the world around us, and about our impacts on the world, and the impact of the world on us. But I don't think it necessarily tells us how we should interact in the world. It's a piece of evidence that we can use, or science builds evidence that we can use to make decisions about ethics and being moral within the world.
And I think I'm in a very similar sort of place. And I think part of what comes through that is a sense of there is a degree of confidence that we can meaningfully understand things, but there's also a humility about that, knowing that our perception and our reasoning is always flawed, and is more of a probabilistic sense of knowledge than one that it's a binary yes I believe or no I don't. So I think that's a healthier way of going about things. And as you went through, sorry, go on.
So I was just going to say, and the complexity of ideas and what we know as real or whatever, I think becomes science gets less and less able to answer or to identify the truth about reality as things become more complex. So we might be able to investigate, very complex systems like ecosystems and ecologies. We might be able to investigate certain things and understand a small part of it, but I certainly don't think we understand all of it, and it's very hard for us to understand, even with science, all of it. Yeah.
And one of the tricks for me is that I think that humility is really important, but some people, I think, take that humility so far that they give up on science, or they draw the limits of our capability when we're not sure that is actually really a limit. So I like the idea of the humility, but that doesn't mean we should give up or we should stop or we should say, here's a boundary and we can know no more. It's like, well, I'm not quite sure, right? We should be humble the other way too and just keep working to find out and get comfortable with uncertainty in the meantime.
Absolutely, and science is for hundreds of years and thousands of years if we go back even further. But modern science and the modern scientific method, we show that we can, if we stick at it and we continue to think about things, and we have enough money often, we can figure out ways to sort of ask questions. And there's very, very, very smart people in the world that are able to figure out ways to ask questions about the physical world and reality around us, that helps us better understand the universe. So I agree. I think that with time and focus and dedication, we can answer lots and lots of questions. I'm not sure we can answer all questions, but I think we can answer a whole lot of them. But I suppose the other thing about science and teaching science and doing science, what on the other side from it, from like people who are very positivist, and they really believe that science can answer everything. I have some misgivings about going too far down that road, and that people get a little bit like scientism, I think, is a real thing, and that we need to be cautious about scientism, that science has all of the answers. Because I don't think it does. I think that it's a combination of ethics, philosophy, values, and science helps us, is another aspect of our of evidence and our values that feeds into decision making and our understanding of the world.
And we'll come into that, obviously, into the second question about what matters and why. And just to dig a little bit into the sort of path you followed, you didn't grow up in a sort of supernatural mindset or a religious one either, but you clearly engaged with it. And as you engaged with it and decided that wasn't something that floated your boat, was that sort of evidence and reason and facts, and hold on, there are inconsistencies here and it just doesn't seem to be true, it's much more likely to be human created deity than a deity that created a human? Or was it, as you hinted at with your mum's experience, a rejection of some of the sort of ethical implications that flow through some interpretations of a religious worldview, or was it a bit of both? And from that, was your sense really negative about religion as a result? Or was it more of a sort of intellectual curiosity? I want to stay engaged. I can see the good and the bad, because it can play out in different ways for different people. And, the new atheists, sort of angry atheists.
Yeah. So I think certainly at the start, it was sort of like just being confused by all of the inconsistencies, and clearly, well, to me, what I think it's like magic. I read almost exclusively fantasy and sci-fi, and religion is just another fantasy book. It really seems that way to me. It reads that way, and it's it's just pie in the sky stuff. It really made me wonder, what the hell are the people believing? I couldn't just blindly believe in something. And I suppose there was actually, even during high school, I had a friend. I worked at a bakery, and there was a baker there who was also very religious, and I was interested in just understanding more and trying to figure out where these inconsistencies came from and why people were believing in these inconsistencies. And I'd go along to church with him a couple of times, and I sort of I feel like I remember making a comment or asking about an inconsistency, and they just, they always default to faith, or it was always a default to faith. Well, we just have faith. It's a test from God, is testing our faith, and it's not for us to know everything. Sometimes we've just got to have faith that God knows the path. It's all like there's also this sort of idea of giving, and maybe I'm not this sort of person, but giving over yourself and everything of who you are to someone else to make all the decisions for you. Basically, it seems to me, well, from conversations with friends and things who were particularly religious, it seems to me that you're letting, that I would have been letting a whole lot of my thinking be done by others. And I'm just not into that. I really value being able to think through things. It's just not. It's just not part of who I am. I suppose I'm very skeptical, actually. And I probably have been since I can remember. I've always been sort of very skeptical about just claims that people would make, and I'd want to know, well, where are you getting that from? Like, who says that's the case? Show me some evidence or citation, or get the F out. But yeah, so certainly I was just confused by things, and I've never. And then yeah. So clearly, when I was in that phase during my teenage years, I was also sort of like reading a lot into the problems that religion causes and all of that. So I suppose I was part of the. I wouldn't say I was an angry atheist, but I was sort of on that side of things, I suppose, in terms of thinking about religion and thinking it just, we don't really need it much. I've softened a little bit on that. I suppose what I now think a little bit more about is, I think that religion provides connection for a lot of people. It provides a social safety net, and I think that's really valuable. But I don't think it's certainly not exclusive to religion. It's just that maybe in certain countries and societies, we've got such an individualistic sort of lifestyle now. Maybe work has become so full on that we don't really make time, perhaps, to really build those communities and have that social network. And religion is a easy way and welcoming place. I mean, it's something that they do very, very well, is be welcoming, and we could all give a little bit more of that, I suppose.
And I think that's the balance I try and sometimes fail to achieve, which is, I think you just can be clear enough about the specific behaviors, actions, beliefs, harms, and benefits, right? As long as you're clear, so we can appreciate the compassion and the community and the value people get from that. As sentient beings, they are getting good experiences, right? That's something positive. But at the same time, I think we can be very clear about where there are harms, and some of them we absolutely should be angry about, and some sort of deference to religion or supernatural beliefs should not dull that. And sometimes it does. It does feel like even some of the biggest, most obviously established religions have this sort of social force field around them that defend them from criticisms for even the most egregious, obvious harm. So it's a tricky balance, but that doesn't mean you have to viciously categorize all possible religious or supernatural beliefs as necessarily associated with those actions, right? We can zero in and get much more specific. So yeah, one of the other things I'm interested in, and it sounds like this was maybe the path your mum took, but was some people will move away from an established religious institution, but they will maintain a sort of sense of a higher power or sense of transcendence. And one of the routes I'm interested in is that many people find that as they get more connected with the environmental environmental themes of thought and the environmental movement, and they find a different sort of sense of transcendence and connectedness and awe and wonder there. Now, for some people, that remains, relentlessly naturalistic. I feel that, right? I feel awe and wonder and a sense of connectedness with nature, but that's in a totally naturalistic context. For other people, it maintains something of the supernatural, maybe the spiritual or the transcendent. Where was that ever a path that tempted you, a sort of spiritual environmental connection?
No, not really. No, I suppose, and I might be reading this wrong, but more of I think the awe and just like, why can't we just love it for what it is, rather than investing some sort of supernaturalness into it or some sort of myth into it? I think that it is so wonderful, and the world, the universe, it is so magnificent that we can just appreciate it for being incredibly magnificent and unknowable and beautiful. And I think that's where I come from. I suppose, is it Einstein's God? Einstein made some sort of comment about about God and it's the universe, or and it's not necessarily a spiritual thing. It's just being like, it's I don't know. It's cool. It's very understated.
I think Spinoza was another who sort of thought of it in a similar sense. Yeah, no, I'm very much in that space. I think reality is way more awesome than any fabrication. So why do we need it?
Although a good fantasy book, that's
a good point. That's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah. There's some amazing imaginations out there. So one of the other quick things I wanted to touch on before we move off this question that I thought was interesting is that it does seem that there are different ways of maintaining a religious or a supernatural belief. One is, as you said, to actually give up on naturalism as a method and say, look, I don't need evidence, I don't need reasoning. Actually, one of the most important things is my ability to maintain a belief, to have faith without any evidence, regardless of evidence. In a sense, that is the point of what I'm doing. That shows a commitment to my God, is that I don't need evidence, right? I'm just there. So that's an interesting class, because it's deliberately expressly saying I don't need methodological naturalism, and that's leading me to a supernatural ontology, if you like. I believe a God exists and X, Y, Z. But there's also another class.
Or maybe, yeah, so it leads to a supernatural ontology, but it might be that there's some sort of fulfillment that they gain from that, giving over of themselves to faith. And I wonder if that's from a biological perspective and a psychological, sociological sort of perspective, whether it's that sort of they gain something through that faith. Yeah. And I mean, we see it. You see it sort of with people who maybe get over addiction. Religion enters their life and it changes their life, and it's because of their ability to give over themselves to someone or something. There is a benefit, so I think it almost is natural, but it's sort of.
I agree, and that was another thing you touched on, and I dug into this a bit with one of my previous guests, Barbara King, and I think Frans de Waal, another previous guest, has looked at this as well. Is actually digging into the psychologically, even evolutionary roots of religious and supernatural thinking, even going pre-human and thinking, to what extent can you see at least the sort of the roots, if not. Not necessarily suggesting chimpanzees have a religion, right? But at least the roots of some of those evolutionary patterns of thinking that you can feel coming through these. It's absolutely fascinating. But I guess there is another group of people who maintain a religious or a supernatural belief who will say, oh, no, I'm absolutely with you on methodological naturalism, right? I'm using evidence and reason, and it's led me to this belief in, a Christian God or whatever it is. So I find it fascinating that there are two. I'm probably oversimplifying, but there seem to be at least two different camps. One who just says it's faith, and in a sense, you've lost the basis for a conversation at that point. At least with the people who still claim a commitment to methodological naturalism, theoretically, you can engage with evidence and reason. What often you find there, I think, is that it's really a pretend naturalism.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think you can engage. Yeah, you can't engage with reason with them, because they're obviously not using reason and evidence to come to their conclusions. It's pseudoscience, really. It's a dangerous path that leads to false understanding of reality. And I think actually I tend to prefer to speak to people who are just like faith, because they're clearly aware, they're self-aware enough to know that they're not bullshitting themselves about.
It's less frustrating.
Yeah, because I think the other side, they're trying to play a game that they can't win at. But one of the tenets of naturalism and science and reason is that you are willing to change your understanding based in new evidence. And I suppose they've got the answer, and they're trying to provide evidence that comes to that answer. At that point, it's philosophy; it's not science.
Yeah,
and I think
it's certainly not naturalism. Yeah.
No. So I tend to. They're the sorts of people I used to have conversations with, and I just got to a point where I'm like, it's a waste of my time to discuss things with them, because no one's sort of there's no conversation you would hope could be a little bit of give and take and understanding and growth, but there's no growth in those conversations, I don't think. Not that I've seen anyway.
I agree. And I think that pattern of thinking is more frustrating. And this may be too strong a word, but it feels actually more insidious in a sense. Whereas the faith conversation is, in a sense, more honest, right? I think they're wrong too, but it's more honest. Whereas the pretend naturalism is somewhat insidious because it's so clearly motivated by, as you said, we hold the belief and we'll construct whatever we can to try and justify it rather than the other way around.
And also, I suppose with the faith one, you can see people who do that sort of have that same process of sort of giving themselves over to something else, like the higher power, I suppose, but not be religious. There are people who will go through that same process, I suppose, but not under a religious banner. So I think there's something beneficial there, and it's useful, and it can be useful for, I suppose, I see those people as using religion as the thing to achieve what they want to achieve, I suppose, in the world. It's one of the pathways to that.
Yeah, I agree. And it's quite interesting to see how quite often in this section of the conversation, we talk most about religion, but just because it's so pervasive, most people on the planet still purport to believe in it. It's so influential and everything, but it's certainly not the only instance of this question about naturalism and supernaturalism. And I think both those modes of thinking feed through into other instances. So whether you want to look at alternative medicine or flat earth or QAnon conspiracy theories or anything Gwyneth Paltrow sells or MLMs or cults, I need to check this with my lawyers, if only I had a lawyer. But through a lot of those, you do see pieces or conspirituality and maybe the wellness world where it gets into sort of mystical stuff. There are some parts which are genuinely faith-based, and this sense of giving over. I'm giving myself over to this cult leader or to this business model or to whatever. But it seems more common in those other sort of modern conspiracy theories that it's more the pretend naturalism thing where, oh, no, we do have the evidence. There is the trail. Here are the crumbs that will lead you into it. I don't know. It's an interesting, but it still seems that both of those modes of thinking play through. But it feels like there's more pretend naturalism now than just.
Yeah, and that may be because, science is a heuristic that we use to sort of gain legitimacy about something, and it's sort of a shortcut to say, okay, you can trust this, you can believe in this, and if you can suggest that my truth about the world is based in evidence and science, then it's probably going to shortcut a whole lot of people's sort of reasoning mechanisms, so that they go, oh, well, okay, well, if it's scientific. And this is why we see so many nutrition crappy pseudoscience that tries to use the language of science to trick people into believing that they should trust or put faith in something that, or believe in something that isn't.
And I find that deeply depressing. But maybe there's a positive message to take, which is it's an indication of the success of scientific thinking as a heuristic, that people are misusing it in this sense, but maybe that's too optimistic of me.
Oh yeah, I think that we're seeing the last 10 years, I suppose, we're seeing the pressure that mass information can have on that, and the mass sharing of niche ideas, I suppose, that then don't become niche ideas. They get taken up. Like QAnon is the classic. That stuff is like batshit.
It's mind-blowing, isn't it?
Totally wild and incredibly fascinating that people can really dig into this stuff and really believe it. I call them so I do a little bit about this in my science communication course at uni, and I call them true believers. And I think that there's actually a so we talk about science communication ethics and stuff, and I sort of ask students, do you treat a true believer differently to how you treat someone who's just doing it for gain, like a company or something? Like, what is the way that you try to communicate and converse with a true believer? And the answer is, it's really hard. It is incredibly hard, and it usually takes, you talk to, it's basically cult style thinking, I think, it in lots of cases, and we see this with modern day cults. If I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that, but like Seventh-day Adventists and stuff like that, where many people never get out. And this is true of, I think we can say, non-religious cults are probably maybe not as strong as certain religious cults, because religious cults have developed really good mechanisms for control and isolation. But we see that similar stuff happening in conversation. Like if you dig into the QAnon stuff and the current information sort of world allows this, where you get into bubbles and you're isolated from other ideas and other thoughts, and you start to create communities. So there's this great podcast, is it Oh No, Ross and Carey? And have you come across that? It's really good. It's they go and use or learn or do wellness and paranormal and all that sort of thing. They're skeptics, and they go on a course of a paranormal course, or they'll go to a wellness conference. And the same methods of building community, although not as necessarily sophisticated for many of these communities, because they are quite dispersed and diverse. I think those same mechanisms, there's people that do try to create them, and we see it in the flat earthers with flat earther conventions, and they're all sort of part of the same social clique, although there's two flat earth sort of competing groups. But yeah, I think it's fascinating, and it certainly shares a lot with religion. Only religion is an accepted mass delusion rather than
and that's one of the things I find fascinating, because I have conversations with many religious people, and we all both agree that, as you say, QAnon is batshit. And then you'll say, well, let's just go back to the fundamentals of your religion, right? And let's talk about batshit. But that's not normally the most productive conversation. But there's the sense to which certain things have just become, background and accepted, and enough people believe them, so it's sort of normal.
It's tradition.
And then when someone says, there's a satanic paedophile death cult in the basement of Pete's area, you go, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Although the same people that might push back against QAnon stuff will believe that there's Satan there's 9 levels of hell or whatever it is, and that Satan's there to punish people. It's like, that is totally wild. It's just totally wild. Really think about what that actually means. It's also quite depressing to think about that life is, anyway, that eternity is spent punished or rewarded for a couple of years on Earth. It doesn't seem like it's a good way to control people anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's a whole fascinating space. I could talk to you about that for hours in its own right, but we should probably move on to the second question about ethics and what matters and who matters. And we've touched on that a little bit already in the conversation, because I find it quite hard to really cleanly separate the two. Some would like to, others think they're tightly meshed. But in this section, I guess it's a particularly interesting question to ask of someone who has a naturalistic worldview, because we don't have, a deity to comply with. We don't have a list of rules from a religious book. We don't have some sort of purported external authority. So there's an obvious question, which I'm sure you've been faced with many times, is, okay, so where do your ethics come from? So maybe that's a good place to start, is, have you thought about, ethics and morality, and how's that changed over time?
I certainly have thought about it. I'm not sure I've got any good answers. I know how I think about ethics somewhat. I think I'm always trying to learn more, and I try to speak with some friends who are much more knowledgeable in the space than me. But I suppose I would say that I think there are some if going back to ecology and my background in ecology and biology, I think that there are, as social beings and social species, I think there are some norms that we might call ethics. That there's ways that you interact in a group to ensure social cohesion and to ensure friendship amongst these groups. And I think that we can get as simple as that. Like we could say that really what it is about relationships and being good to the person next to you, and what is good. And I think we can sort of dig into that, certainly. And we might say that, well, it's making sure that you're not harming them in an unnecessary way, or you're not making them have a worse life than they might have. And most people probably agree with that. I think if you ask most people, that they would understand that to be, well, maybe I'm being particularly Western. I'm not sure Western's the right word anymore, but from a particular Anglo-Saxon philosophical background, European, Eurocentric background and philosophical background, where that's true. That's probably true for most people. So I think there is some sort of naturalistic aspect to ethics in regards to social species. I think there's some evolution that's occurred. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having these conversations probably. When we get into like philosophy and like branches of philosophy or philosophical thought, I'm not particularly knowledgeable about them. But I tend to, from some conversations with people, I tend to be fairly pluralistic. I think that there's ways that we think about the world that work in certain situations, and that using, whether it's deontology, I think there are probably some rules around the ways that we should think about the world, or act in the world, that should guide our ethics, and values or virtue ethics. I think that virtue ethics gets sort of put down a lot, especially in modern philosophy, I think, and especially in a world that really sort of favors, I think, utilitarianism, and consequentialism. I think that virtue ethics, and in the world that I sort of am most active in, which is conservation and thinking about conservation, sort of utilitarianism or consequentialism is the ethical framework that people use. But I think if you step back and say, okay, well, at a community level, I think we all probably agree with certain virtues, like honesty and trust and caring, being a caring person, being an honest person. I think these are things that we'd like to see in others, and we'd like others to enact in the world. And we can probably agree that if people did do that, then we would have a pretty good world. And then I think when things get really tricky, so I do tend to also sort of get into I think that utilitarianism or consequentialism. Sorry, I always use those interchangeably, and I shouldn't. But I think consequentialism also has some uses, that it can help us think about really tricky issues. Although I don't tend to just use consequentialism. I think that consequentialism with certain rules, because I think that's what we do with humans. We are not consequentialist when it comes to humans on the majority of ethical choices that we make. I think it's consequentialism with deontology, and then at a broader level, virtue ethics can help guide us as a society or a community or a culture or whatever it is. No, and then I was just going to say, and then we can get into sort of who counts or whatever. But maybe can, if you had something.
Yeah, well, we'll do that next, because that's I think an equally important question. And I think you started out, I think, by describing sort of ethics and morality, I think almost definitionally, for me, as some form of concern for others, whether that's as part of a community or a collective, or whether it's other individuals, but it's some concern for others, and by definition a concern for their well-being, their experience, how well their lives are going. Right? I think that, to me, that seems to be the almost definitional core and the most obvious place to start. And beyond that, I'm very comfortable with this sort of pluralistic approach, as long as I think you've got that basis locked in. Now, there are some forms of ethics where people would agree even that with that basis, there are some forms of egoism or nihilism or what, or even maybe some forms of relativism, which might even challenge that basis and say, give different approaches. But I struggle to engage meaningfully with any of them, really. I think, ethics almost by definition is a concern for others.
And I think that's hardwired into us. So I think that is genetic. So I think that a concern for others, is natural.
I agree. And I think you can see that that's not just a human thing either. I think that at least proto-morality predated humanity by many millions of years and exists in, many other sentient species too.
It's an evolutionary mechanism in relation to basically giving birth and having young that need parenting. It's like a parental behavior evolution. So we gain this stuff, and kinship sort of evolutionary mechanisms. I think really are the foundation of this, and that goes back all the way to you can go as far back as you want to find that stuff in animals.
And I'm pretty confident those pre-human mothers feel compassion in a pretty analogous way to the way you and I might too. But I think so I can see those sort of evolutionary roots and just the naturalistic roots of how we came to have at least the default kit we've got in here that drives much of the way we think. But some will follow that through and say, well, therefore, morality is just a question of what's evolutionarily adaptive. So they will take the compassion and the positive in-group cohesion stuff, but they'll also say that it's also survival of the fittest and out-group aggression, and therefore it is just survival of the fittest and anything goes, and humans should model their lives on those of wild predators. And this is just evolution, right? You told us yourself that this is how we evolved to be. It's adaptive. So let's keep those genes driving forward, right? There is no ethics.
The survival of the fittest is so overplayed, and it pisses me off. Like as an evolutionary ecologist, it annoys me so much that it gets like trotted out, because yes, it's survival of the fittest, I suppose, but that's one component. It's also survival of the most caring. It's also survival of the strongest relationships. It's like one aspect of some parts of fitness, but fitness actually, if we look across all of life, a whole bunch of fitness is actually more about caring and relationships and community. And it's just that survival of the fittest is good for a TV show where a lion takes down a gazelle, and it's showy, it's interesting, it's titillizing, and I just it annoys me.
No,
we simplify it down to just that.
I share that frustration, right? Yeah. And I think one of the frustrating things is that it's a denial of a switch that I think other animals took long before us, and we've taken too, which is that through whatever the fluke of evolution, we've developed the cognitive capacity that enables us to say, I don't want to just propagate my genes anymore. Right? That's why I'm not down the sperm bank every day, but trying to maximize my offspring. I mean, that just doesn't make sense. But there are even very serious ethicists, even today, who will still play that evolutionary aspect through into a normative statement about what is good and bad. And
I'm sure we can, and maybe you disagree, but I think that you'd probably agree that ethicists and philosophers often talk shit. And their whole job is to think really deeply on a particular question, and I think that sometimes they get carried away with themselves and they lose sight of what's actually meaningful. And sure, you can have these long-winded arguments all the time, but if we look around us and we see, like you say, that it's and we experience it, like we're doing it right now. We're having a conversation where we, two people who have across the different worlds of each other, and all that sort of jazz, we've both come to the same point where we're like, yeah, but life is more than that. And I think this is then a really interesting question around it's sort of like the emergent property of consciousness and sentience. I think that there's probably an emergent property because social complexity requires this understanding those outside of us and reading cues, and being sensitive to others, that it opens us up to more than that cognitively. And I think that, again, I think this is it's all sort of part of biology and evolution, but it doesn't need to always have an answer. And I think this is one of the things that I think is really important about evolution. Not every single trait is fine-tuned and perfect, and there are these emergent properties that exist. And I think that certainly consciousness and sentience and in certain ways of thinking have created emergent properties that help with reproduction. They help with the fundamentals of reproducing your genes, but they also create more. And I think it's a combination of both sort of having those engagements and being able to read others and empathy and all that sort of jazz, and also drivers that are around like enjoyment and pain. And those combinations of things, when they're brought together, I think open up a mind which is really complex to do a whole lot of really weird and wonderful things that we now see in not just humans, but a whole bunch of other species as well. And I think, I think that it's okay not to, like, these are the sorts of questions and the sorts of things within science that I'm not sure we'll necessarily figure out how to answer that. Does it have an answer? Like, is it something that we can answer? I don't know.
Yeah. And I hope, and I have this sort of naive hypothesis, that compassionate ethics will prove ultimately to be highly adaptive. But even if they're not, I think they're still normatively right. Right.
Yeah, so absolutely.
So the normative ethic is not grounded in its long-term success on an evolutionary basis, right? It's a different thing. Like, that's just physics running, and of course we're just physics running too. But normatively, a compassionate ethic is the right one, because again, by definition, is based on this concern for others. And I agree with the pluralist approach you took before, because again, I think philosophers, I think they can do important grounding work. They go places you don't want to go, and they drive to a level of rigor that sometimes we're not comfortable with. But I agree, they can sort of scurry down rabbit holes and forget the big picture. And in a sense, I'm quite comfortable with a sort of very broadly defined consequentialism, in the sense that if the consequences are about the experiences of other sentient beings, that is a consequence. So that is ultimately what I care about. But I share your skepticism about whether a particular ethical theory is the best way of getting towards that. And each of the different ethical theories has a sort of stereotype of the other they like to attack, and there's a lot of straw manning going on. But there's this view of utilitarians, they're always running a spreadsheet, and that they'll offset your suffering against your flourishing, and so on and so forth. So I think there's some value in utilitarian thinking, but there are some problems in some of the ways it's applied. Virtue ethics is all well and good as long as you pick virtues that deliver good long-term consequences.
Because you can certainly create virtues.
And the same with deontology, right? It's all about how do you pick those rules. And ultimately, I think you should probably pick those useful heuristics based on an estimation of their likely consequences. So I sort of get drawn back to consequence. And the same with the care ethic, right? Yeah, so I sort of have this, I retreat to this position of ultimate consequences, experiences of sentient beings, loads of different ways of getting there, and have some humility about, ethical systems, just as we should have humility about epistemology too, and just keep coming back to these real basics.
And something that I've been sort of thinking more about as well is sort of trying to figure out what I can control in my life and around me. And a lot of in the conservation field, and this is I think it happens all over the world, but in Australia there's a particular flavour of conservation which drops baits and does mass killing of a whole bunch of sentient animals because they're not from here and all that sort of jazz.
Conserve through culling.
Yeah, exactly. And they're often like, we have a responsibility to do X. If this thing's happening, we brought them here, or whatever it is, and it's our responsibility to do something about it. But I think that us taking on the responsibility of the outcomes, the ethical outcomes, or just the outcomes of other beings is quite arrogant and can be so egoistic and also really anthropocentric. And it then always references animals to us. They're always in reference to us. And I think I've been thinking more about that as, maybe not a great thing. It's sort of this idea, it leads to ideas around, anthropocentrism and domination, I think. And it allows so many, it's sort of like a white savior approach, I find.
Yeah. And that's probably a good point to come onto the second part of this ethical question, which is who gets to matter, because almost regardless of what your ethical system is, if you exclude a chunk of sentient beings or even humans from your consideration, you can be a wonderful virtue ethicist, but if you only care about, Aryans or people from Norfolk or whatever, then your ethical system has a fundamental deep flaw. And part of the reason I focus on this question, and part of the reason Sentientism focuses on that moral scope, is because I think it is the most important ethical question. Because if you're excluded, anything goes, right? You could be tortured and killed with impunity. It's neutral. It just doesn't matter. You do not count at all, right? And that's not a good place to be. But it does seem to be very largely neglected by moral philosophy. There is this, not by all of them, of course, and there are many people who've done really important work here over centuries even, but the bulk of moral philosophy has this inbuilt assumption that only humans matter, and sometimes only some humans matter. Now let's work on how to make the world better for them. And I'm like, you've skipped over the most fundamental, most critical, most damaging moral question. What the hell is going on? Anyway, so
and one of the biggest systems in the world to enforce, whether rightly or wrongly, our a community's understanding of ethics is legal system, and it totally excludes almost everywhere in the world totally excludes other animals.
Yeah, and you can play that through almost every institution and rule and aspect of our lives, whether it's law, whether it's the SDGs, whether it's thinking about rights, whether it's policies, whether it's the way corporations operate. It's just that anthropocentrism runs through. So, and it would be good to come back to your challenge in terms of anthropocentrism and the problems that has in the environmental space. But before we go on to that, how did you go through that journey yourself in terms of, who gets to matter, in terms of where you started out as your childhood, how your thinking's evolved, and where do you set that boundary if you have one now in terms of who gets to count in your ethical calculations?
Yeah, it's a greght question. It's one I'm always, I think, thinking about. Although I'm a little bit more settled on something nowadays than I have been in the past. But I used to be a diehard. Nah, it's just humans, and I used to rag on the vegetarian who I met in university, and I'd was rude to them and was like, "Oh, why would you do that?" Blah blah blah, blah, that whole thing.
Yeah.
And
look at these carnivore teeth.
Yeah, exactly. And I said all the stupid stuff. But then I met someone who was vegetarian and had some really good chats, basically, and went and watched Earthlings. And that set me vegetarian for about 6 months, so that I didn't have a support structure at all, and lapsed. And then about a year or two later, I was doing research on a bird, lapwing. They're masked lapwings down here in Australia, and they're sort of like, imagine they're a ground nesting bird, and they just nest out in the middle of open areas. So there'll be, if you've got a lawn, perfect habitat for a lapwing to come and nest, and they are really cool birds, great parents. And I was doing sort of some research on their survival in urban area, and I was looking. It was a rainy morning. Get up early, go out, look for these birds. I was looking out at these lapwings, and I'm like, they're about the size of a chicken, a bit smaller, and look sort of like a chicken, I suppose. They've got the same similar structure and whatnot. And I was looking out, and I'm like, would I run out there and eat you? And I'm like, I wouldn't. So why am I doing that for chickens? And I went vegetarian, and then a couple of years later, I don't know why, veganism just wasn't on my radar for some reason. I was not thinking about milk and dairy and eggs and things. But it was about 2 years later, I was research, and this is a total wild thing, but I was killing a whole bunch of birds because I was taught in my science degree, and I was using the sort of scientism basically to justify the killing of these animals for science and for knowledge and under false pretenses of conservation. And that's a whole different story. But I was out there and I went to a whole bunch of, found these birds at dairy farms. So I went to like a dozen dairy farms from Tasmania in Australia up to Queensland, like thousands of kilometers, all the way up. And at every dairy farm, I saw something atrocious. And I was like, I just can't do this anymore. I'd never been confronted with what my behaviors were having. And so that just opened up my worldview to what we do to animals in particular. And so I went vegan and started sort of getting into animal activism and animal rights at that stage, I suppose. And so that really changed how I think about the world and who matters. And it certainly made me understand that the who is morally considerable is much wider than just humans. And where I'm at the moment, I suppose that I think that a whole bunch of things are morally considerable. Sentient animals certainly very high up and garner a particular type of consideration, a particular type of response and behavior. But I also don't want to hurt animals that may be not sentient. I think nowadays I'm more of a live and let live. And even with like plants and things, like I was out putting in a tree this afternoon before coming on here, and I'm happy ripping up the grass and stuff. But I'm not just going to go and destroy a whole bunch of plants or cut down a tree for no reason. I think that I would consider it a lot before I do it. And my approach is usually just to leave it alone unless because the tree is not just a tree, it's also an ecosystem for a whole bunch of invertebrates, a whole bunch of birds, a whole bunch of whatever, possums where we live and all that sort of jazz. So I think, yeah, I'm more of I think a whole bunch of things matter. I think it's mostly life that matters, and that there's a gradient of moral responsibility towards that life, all the way from, doesn't really matter a whole bunch and doesn't require a whole lot of me, but I shouldn't just be go out and be willy-nilly destructive because I can, but all the way up to, I should not be causing harm in any way to these individuals, and there may be in some circumstances where I should be trying to create a world which is enjoyable for them. And I suppose that the latest evolution of my thinking around this stuff is sort of all of these things, like all of these sorts of animals and life is morally considerable to different degrees. But I also think that there is a different responsibility, and not in terms of like the fundamentals around ethical regard or moral consideration of a particular individual or species or whatever it is, individual, but more in regards to what I should do and how I should behave. I think it's closeness and relationship and efficacy. So, and this is something in conservation I've been thinking about. It's like so I have some controversial ideas in Australia about cats, for instance. I'm like, I think that cats in urban environments are basically in their native habitat. They've co-evolved with humans in urban or human-dominated landscapes for thousands of years, and they're doing what they do, along with a whole bunch of other species that do the same, and they predate on those same species, so mice and birds and whatnot. And in Australia, I think a big difference is we have a lot of native species that haven't co-evolved with cats that live in our urban areas that are also harmed, and not to mention like outside of urban areas. But I tend to be like, so I let my cat outside, and my cat goes and does things. One of them seems to not do a whole lot of killing, though I'm sure she does a bit. But the other one kills stuff, kills animals. And I really care, and I will stop her from killing animals. And we put her inside at nights and that sort of thing. And I think it's my moral responsibility to stop her from killing rabbits when I'm there and when I'm seeing it and when it's happening and whatnot. But I don't think it's my moral responsibility to stop all cats from killing all rabbits, for instance. I think that it's not possible. And it's sort of an overreach of my my understanding of the world onto both my cat and the rabbit, who experience and live in a world that is different to mine. And I suppose, and some people might call it a cop-out, but I think it's sort of like a humbling of our position and our desire to be the arbiters of what is right or wrong in the world. And I just don't think we are. I don't think we are the ones to get to say that this is the wrong thing to be happening, although I do stop it if I see it happening in front of me.
And I'd like to dig into that in a bit as well. And I think within this moral scope, there are so many different ways of prioritizing, and scientism deliberately stays neutral on that. But I think one thing that is very common is that, and it sort of makes sense from an effectiveness point of view, as you said, is to prioritize the things you can actually have an effect on and that you're in interactions with as well. So I think that makes sense. And I think in practical terms, I probably come back to similar sort of spaces as you are in terms of moral considerability. And scientism doesn't say you should only exclusively have moral consideration for sentient beings, but it just says at least you should have moral consideration for sentient beings. So many people who call themselves a sentientist will say all sentient beings get moral consideration, and I'll go further. Personally,
and high moral, like high
yes, and a distinct level of it because of their capacity to suffer and flourish.
Strong.
I agree. So it's not just moral consideration; it's like a particular, special, distinctive. So even people who grant moral consideration to a carrot still recognize that there's a radical difference between, putting a knife into a freshly plucked carrot and doing the same to a pig. Right? So I completely agree. Right, there's that different stance. Personally, I'm quite a strict sentientist, and I think that ultimately everything does come back to the experiences of sentient beings. But at the same time, I recognize, our epistemic and maybe ontological uncertainty about the boundaries of sentience. So I'll give even very simple animals the benefit of the doubt as well. I don't want really.
Where does that go down to? What's a simple animal for you?
Well, for me, it's quite far. So I will even give bivalves the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, I'm the same. Yeah.
And whereas, others are more comfortable.
Or jellyfish or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, sea sponge has got no nervous system whatsoever, so I'm really struggling. But that's sort of where I am. It's like the super, super simplest is roughly where this fuzzy boundary is for me. But other people said it differently. I think that's that. People will follow the evidence where they want to. But at the same time, so I think the behavior and the communication capabilities of plants are amazing, and we'll continue to learn more about them. But I've seen nothing that suggests they have the capacity to actually subjectively experience anything at all. People talk about the communications and so on, but I haven't seen anyone suggest that they actually have that capacity. But regardless, I wouldn't needlessly, go out and destroy plants or ecosystems either. But I guess technically the reason I do that is because I think of the knock-on impacts on the sentient beings as well as the aesthetic experience for me too, right? So there's a grey area there, but I think practically I'll probably end up in a similar sort of space. But you've already come on to another interesting angle. So one challenge to sentientism is people saying, no, we need to be anthropocentric. We should just focus on the humans because we're special, right? Either for a religious reason or a naturalistic reason, whatever it is, right? And you and I would both reject that. And it's also a bit bizarre because even most anthropocentric people reject it, really, because if they have a companion animal or, anyway, let's not go there, right? I just don't get it. Anyway, but sentientism is often criticized from a different perspective as well. And I think the first time the term was really used was properly in this context was by a chap called John Rodman in 1977. And he was taking a more expansive biocentric or ecocentric view and was criticizing people focusing on sentience and saying, look, you're discriminating against the non-sentient stuff. You're discriminating against plants and rocks and rivers and trees and ecosystems. We need to have biocentric or ecocentric stance. And you've already talked about, you maybe more generous. You think about life, not just sentience. You do put sentience at a different distinctive stance, but you have a biocentric sensibility as well about living things, even if they're not sentient. And I guess I'm sympathetic to that, as long as the sentient beings still get that serious level of distinctive moral consideration. From your work in the environmental space, how do you think that plays out? Because I have a deep frustration, which I always rant
it doesn't
about
play
here.
out well. Yeah,
it doesn't play out well.
And this is where I've strongly disagree with current conservation practice in many places, and more of a compassionate conservationist, and lean into that a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because
Mark Beckhoff was a previous guest as well.
Yeah.
I know he's done quite a lot of work on that.
Yeah, exactly. One of the key people that sort of developed that idea, compassionate conservation. And so I think one of the main, so in conservation, what happens is we've got conservation values, and it's like prioritizing or valuing collectives. So environmental collectives, natural collectives, and these are communities, these are species, these are ecosystems, and that it usually, well, it not only usually, it does sort of deprioritize individuals, and individuals become a means to an end for the collective. And it legitimizes, on a consequentialist sort of approach, a whole lot of really atrocious practices, from wide-scale baiting using poisons that can take hours to days to cause horrendous sort of deaths for very, some of the most sentient creatures that we might think of, to killing, to experimentation on animals, and just making choices for animals in a way that is interesting to us as scientists, or interesting conservation, but might not actually be in the best interest of the animal. And so I get criticism, or have, like, people don't like the idea of considering animals more strongly within conservation, because they think it takes away certain tools, and then it becomes like this moral panic. There becomes this moral panic that if we're not allowed to kill animals for conservation, then the whole world is going to turn into depleted, and we're only going to have 10 different species. I'm being a little bit hyperbolic here, but they just basically say all sort of things will get turned into the same, and we'll just have cats everywhere, and we'll have foxes everywhere and rabbits everywhere, and we won't have any native species anywhere, and it'll be horrible, and the world will collapse, and ecosystems will collapse, and all that sort of jazz. And it's not very it's not very scientific, first off, and it also just allows really horrible things to happen, basically. And I'm doing some research where we're trying to look at we are looking at the way that experiments and research in conservation impacts animals, and we're trying to draw out what actually might be the experience of animals that isn't being represented in a paper, when they say 26 quolls were trapped, and this thing was done to them, and we took them into captivity and bred them for 5 years, and blah 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 blah. It's sort of like there's a whole bunch of stuff that's happening to those individuals that is, in my opinion, not okay. And it's sort of like if we changed it to talking about humans, we just wouldn't even consider many of the things that we do to a whole bunch of animals. It's just not something that would even come into our wouldn't even be close to.
And I think that's always a really interesting thought experiment. even if you don't think that non-human sentience and human sentience should be granted the same level of moral consideration, if you think they both should be granted some, I think that's a really interesting thought experiment to go, would we do that to another group of humans or another individual? And often the answer is staring us in the face. And I'm sympathetic to using thinking about collectives and thinking systemically, and I'm sympathetic to criticisms of a sort of relentlessly individualistic focus. So I sort of get that, but I think thinking about the collectives and the systems are useful because they're analytically useful levels at which to understand the impact that is ultimately only salient because of the impact on the individuals, because the collective, the habitat, the species, the ecosystem does not experience anything, right? It doesn't suffer at all. Gaia doesn't care about anything in a sense. In a sense, so yeah, I share that frustration, and I think it both impacts how we engage with the wild, if you like, and the natural world, whatever that is. Because I think you're right; it can pervert and cause and justify and excuse catastrophic suffering sometimes in the pursuit of aims which are, supporting the well-being of abstract concepts that don't have the well-being.
Although the argument, and it's a really important point that's made, that well, if you, and this is where I get a little bit starting to push back on certain language that's used, but sort of the argument goes, well, if you let the fox continue to live there, then there's a whole bunch of individuals that you're causing significant harm to by allowing the fox to live. And that's where I think we are taking far too much responsibility for these relationships that are happening outside of our remit. I think that these are sort of, I feel like we're being too white savior about that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And how do we get that balance right? Because on the one hand, there's a form of anthropocentrism that just says, right, even if it's driven by a compassion, right, we're here to pile in, we're going to intervene, we're going to fix things, we're going to sort things out, even if it's driven by a compassion.
Yes,
that can have a sense.
It often is driven by compassion. Absolutely.
Yeah, it often is. But there's also and I share that in a sense rejection of anthropocentrism, because I think we should be sentiocentric. But there are some people who will push back on anthropocentrism to such a degree that they will say, hands off. If humans haven't caused an issue, we have no obligation whatsoever to engage in, for example, the suffering of animals in the wild. And some will say that's because we shouldn't have the hubris to intervene. And others will say, well, no, I have a reverence for nature, and whatever's in nature must be by definition good, and therefore I will happily watch the nature program with the lion tearing apart the gazelle and feel not a moment of compassion for the suffering of quadrillions of sentient beings. So how do you balance that rejection of anthropocentrism with still some sort of, not just, hands up, we're walking away?
And I think this is where conservation comes in. But I think that conservation values are important, that conserving biodiversity, conserving ecosystems and species is a valuable thing to do. But I just don't agree that we should do that at the expense of killing a whole bunch of individuals. And there's a whole bunch of other opportunities that we can take. Like, first off, we can sort of change human behaviors and human ways of engaging in the world that might support conservation. So maybe eating less animals, shock horror, and rewilding a whole bunch of places.
Well, that's another super stark source of frustrating dissonance. Is one, we can have these frustrating conversations about how to engage with the wild and conservation. The other is the mainstream environmental movement cares more about rocks and rivers than it does about pigs and chickens. And again, it just
even though, like, the stat that always gets me is that if we look at mammalian biomass in the world, 60% is made up of animal, like farmed animals, so pigs, cows, and others. 36% is made up of humans. So that's total at this point. So all mammalian biomass on land in the world is 96%. 96% both human and farmed animal. 4% is wildlife. And if we look at the amount of land that we have available to sort of allowing nature to flourish and allowing species and ecosystems to flourish and all that sort of jazz, it's small, and it's getting smaller because we use so much of it for animal agriculture. And so my really big thing that I am interested in seeing is, if we take animals seriously, if we can take animals seriously, one, it means we change the way that we engage with animals, say, in conservation, and it might actually make us more concerned about the world, because I tend to think that you can't, and something that I've got to do some research into and test. But I think that if you care about animals, then you necessarily need to care about their habitat and their environment and the community that they live within, because it supports them. It's sort of like a necessary part of their life. So if you care about animals, you'll care about the environment. But it also means, if we take animals more seriously, means we get rid of bloody animal agriculture and we open up a whole swathe of land and resources and whatnot for the environment.
And I didn't understand this before I started getting more involved in understanding the facts of the matter. But the sheer inefficiency of animal agriculture just through feed conversion ratios is mind-blowing. And that's and my understanding of it is if we, and let's come on to this, right, because the final question is, how can we make a better world in that context, right? If we try and take a naturalistic approach and we genuinely care about all sentient beings and the ecosystems they're part of, what can we do? But because of that feed conversion ratio and the radical inefficiency, I mean, people talk about food waste. If you want to see food waste, look at how much of global crops we feed through animals and turn into shit and piss and heat and pain and suffering. Right? It's mind-blowing, such that if we switched from our current agricultural system to a plant-based system, it would free up 3/4 of all agricultural land, which is basically like a couple of continents. And whether you use that for rewilding or solar or parkland or whatever else, right? The scale of it is just breathtaking. It's not just the core, it's not only the core ethical horror at its heart. It's the sheer scale of environmental and climate and pollution impact we're having through these practices as well. And yet it's a taboo topic, even in the mainstream environmental movement. I talked to Alex Lockwood as a previous guest, and he was in tears at COP26 because they're serving steak and animal products at lunch at COP26. And anyway,
makes no sense.
It's insane.
And the other thing about conservation is so many of the issues or reasons for killing animals, and particularly predators, is that they interfere, and usually only a very small amount, with lives, like with farmed animals. Like we build the rod,
fish or our
we build the rod for our own back. It's similar to over in the UK. I remember the largest natural experiment, environmental experiment, wildlife experiment in the world was done in the UK with badgers and the badger cull over TB. And this was in 2000s or something. They killed a whole bunch of about 10,000 badgers. It's something huge. It was a big number. They killed a whole bunch of badgers for a whole number of years to find out that badgers actually weren't a meaningful transmitter of TB into cows. And we had this person come to university, and they were the lead scientist for that, who I think was like a lord or something, and they were the chief scientist in the UK or something like that. And they were talking about, so what we found out is blah 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 blah, and badgers, we shouldn't kill them because it's not actually doing anything. They're not meaningfully doing anything to spread TB. Although people still kill badgers, and there's still, it still happens a lot. And my question to them was, well, what if we just stopped having the cows? What's the issue then? Like, do we still have this problem? No, we don't, because we don't have any cows to transmit TB to. Like, it's just wild. It is insane to me. It I shouldn't say insane. It is wild to me that we create these situations and then get upset about them. And then, who suffers? It's animals. It's other sentient animals who suffer, and often lots of people. So, the inequalities around the distribution of food in the world, and how much of the grains that are grown in other parts of the world to feed farmed animals for Western consumption or for capitalist consumption. It's
mind-boggling.
It is mind-boggling, but there are so many.
And it gives, and in a sense, it gives the lie to many people who profess a sort of ecocentric worldview or an environmentalist worldview. It's often just a veneer on anthropocentrism, right? So I like the aesthetics because I enjoy watching the nature programs and going to a park. I want this set of ecosystem services because I need the temperature in the right place and I need a clean water supply and so on. But do I genuinely have a moral consideration for this broader ecosystem, including other sentient beings? Not so much. It's just the latest latest spin on anthropocentrism. But we share that frustration, and this final question is in that context, because in a way, it feels, I think, to you and me and people who agree with us about a naturalistic and a roughly sentiocentric worldview, that many of these answers are somewhat obvious. There are clear win-win-win staring it in the face, screaming out, and yet the human species generally, keeps walking on down the path. In that context, how do you think about how we can make a better future? And that might be, specific interventions, but it might also be how the hell do we cope with this, I think, the central problem of human psychology and social norms, given the challenges we're facing. You can take that wherever you like. And I'm particularly interested because you've done work on, more the practical side of transition to plant-based systems and so on, but you can talk more broadly too, of course.
So I think, I think there's a few key things that are going to sort of get us somewhere good, and I'm hopeful. Like the movement of people considering these sorts of things and considering animals more seriously, moving to plant-based diets, seems to be growing in my country and yours and others around the world. People, and I think this is born out of the information age that we live in, the easy sharing of videos and content, which it's very clear that people are obsessed with animals, because half the videos on the internet and TikTok and all that sort of jazz are about animals and doing interesting, fun stuff, and people love them. And we love animals, like we really do. I think there is something in most people, not all people, but in most people, there is this recognition of the individual. I think that we can really lean into that.
Yeah,
so
people,
I think that's
in a sense, people they're sort of already there in an important way, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think that the animals in our homes have helped that so much over the last 30 years, in particular. So I think that, let's say, leaning into people's sometimes their propensity to care for animals and see something in other animals, and really considering the psychology of the thing. So I think there's some really great work going on with psychologists around the world, like the FAIR, which is a group in the UK, I think, and from the US, who are bringing together psychologists who are working on human-animal intergroup relations, and which is
I think
really
they're launching
exciting.
their new journal this afternoon. Although by the time we get this out, it will be a month ago. So
yeah. But yeah, so they're really great, and there's already been 10 years probably of people investigating and doing more research into our relationships with animals. It's mostly been around meat consumption to this point, but that's expanding always. And I think there's some really good insights, and there's a great paper that I always love to plug by Hank Rothgerber, I think, who wrote a paper called Meat-Related Cognitive Dissonance, and he provides a framework that outlines 13 different mechanisms that are used. He does a big review of psychological literature over a couple of decades, or at least certainly a decade of literature, and identifies a whole bunch of mechanisms that are used when people are faced with the cognitive dissonance of eating meat. And I think that has some fantastic insights. How do we push through this? How do we get to somewhere more meaningful for animals? I think that it's one, having the conversations, like just being open for the discussions, being personable and having the conversations with people who are interested or just wondering what it's all about. Supporting groups and organizations who engage in this sort of work that is trying to make people consider, or help people consider animals differently. And then more practically, I think in systematic sort of ways, and this is something Nick Pendergrast, someone that we both were on a radio show the other day with, that having more systemic approaches where we ask for the shift and transition to, and campaign for the transition to plant-based diets and those sorts of things. Research and funding into cell-based agriculture. I think that not everyone is going to be won over by arguments around ethics and morality and concern for animals. They're just not. It's too easy, too comfortable. It's too much part of their identity that they eat meat. But if they can get a steak that's cheaper and is grown in a vat, then absolutely, let's do it. And I really think that once meat, because I not sure we'll have the moral revolution without some sort of alternative, and basically that hits people's hip pockets or benefits their pockets, because so many things come back to price and whatnot. If we can make meat cheaper and without cruelty, then I think that'll lead us to a point where we can have that moral revolution, where where people look back and go, why? I think Carnage, Simon Amstell's mockumentary Carnage, did this really well, where they're like, cell-based meat came in, and now 50 years later, people are looking back and going, what were we doing? Like, the way that we treated these other animals is just atrocious.
Once you're no longer implicated in a system, it's much easier to look at it with clear eyes and condemn it. You're sort of free to bring your actions in line with your ethics. The ethics were already always there, and you were just keeping them down. I did for a long while. But once you're free through an easy, convenient alternative, then the moral revolution will come afterwards. Yeah,
absolutely. And another thing that I've been thinking about recently, which leans into some of the stuff we talked about earlier about closeness, relationships, and your own sphere of influence, and just what's around you, who's around you, is just being more attentive to animals around us and teaching each other and helping each other to do that, to listen to animals. So I've wondered, I was at a rodeo protest the other day, and families were bringing their kids to this rodeo, and it was just sort of like, you're sort of thinking, oh God, this is sort of the ongoing generational learning around indoctrination, around harm to animals. But the kids really cherish these experiences where they get to be close to an animal. They don't know what's going on sometimes. Like, they're not understanding that this is systemic abuse and real suffering that's going on with these animals. And I was thinking, what other opportunities are there to create a family experience that also connects people with animals, which clearly people want, and we don't have them. Not ones that are respectful to animals. Maybe some sanctuaries do this, but there's too few of those, and other things like petting zoos, and they're just horrible. So I was like, I wonder whether there's an opportunity, and it makes me think of. I think it was out of Germany, this back to nature sort of learning where kids just get out. There's no syllabus. You just go out into the bush and you freaking grub about, and you climb trees and you do things and you find stuff and whatnot. Just don't eat the poisonous mushrooms. And whether there's something like that where we support and teach people to be attentive to the birds in the trees, and to recognize what they're after, what their desire, like what they're interested in. I think we can if we listen. There's been a myth for so long that we can't know what an animal is thinking, and sure, we can't. Like, I can't know what you're thinking, truly, but I think we know this from our interactions with the animals we have in our homes, that my dog and me, we can communicate. We understand each other. Like, he knows how to get my attention and make me do what he wants.
Yeah, you're well trained.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that if we built people's connection to animals in a way that is respective to the animal and lets us see them in their lives and see their agency and see their them doing their thing, I think that could be powerful. But that's a hypothesis. That's not something I've tested. It's not something I know. Although I think that when you speak to almost any animal person, it's because of a relationship with animals. Usually, there's something that's triggered.
And there's rich research in sort of intrahuman groupishness around intergroup contact theory, right? Where the idea is that you can actually counter racism, for example, by just, in the right environment, getting people to understand each other by contact, and you can build that empathy and that sense of what it might be like to be you. And as you say, it's never perfect, but you can do enough to build compassion and to collaborate. And I think there's so much of that we can do with, across the species boundary as well. If you genuinely get a sense of, whether it is visiting a sanctuary or watching a film like Gunda or something that gives you, a sense, or Cow, more recent one that gives you this sense of what it might actually be like to be them. That is the absolute essence, and that can just resonate through all of our thinking.
You're speaking my language, Jamie. I'm thinking of doing some research on those documentaries, actually.
Oh, brilliant!
Because I think that so this, turning the lens to individuals and trying to help people understand and connect with individuals, and without narrative, without sort of forcing our ideas onto things, people can listen. I think we can hear what animals are saying, not verbally, but through their behaviors, through their interactions. I think we can listen and we can hear. I think that's something that I've been really thinking about in the last year or so, and I'm trying to figure out how to do some research in that.
Yeah,
I think it's fascinating.
And I think there's hope there, because, like you say, we can do it. And if through some of the other interventions you talked about, we can make it easy, I think we might be surprised if you look back in a few decades at how quickly things have changed. But let's see. And I've taken up so much of your time, but I did want to ask you about, I guess, practical transition paths, particularly for communities and industries that are involved in animal agriculture at the moment, because it strikes me that different parts of these movements have focused very strongly on the moral argument and on providing alternative products. But there's some really interesting work going on. I think it's still undeveloped about the how, the practicality. And that's partly because, that's one of the challenges we get, is like, how the hell are you going to make this happen, right? That's actually part of the resistance, is just people can't get their heads around a change of this magnitude. So let's explain it and lay it out. I think partly the reason we need to do it is because we actually need to do it. But it will also help with the argument too, because we can lay these paths out that will work. At the same time, there's often a lot of, oversimplistic, naive thinking. It's right, well, you're a pig farmer, just grow hemp. You're a chicken farmer, just grow mushrooms. We're done, right? And that might be part of the story. But the diversity of transition paths we need are breathtaking and various.
And contextual, like it's going to be different every town you go to, basically, I think.
Yeah, they need to be viable. They need to be in an environmental consciousness context. They need to be something that those communities can actually practically do and survive on. And it goes everywhere from a industrial factory farm in the Midwest of the US to a coastal fishing community in a really poor part of a country in Southeast Asia. And the scale of that challenge shouldn't put us off addressing it, but I think we need to understand the sheer scale and complexity. And it's also not just a one-to-one transition from animal agriculture to plant agriculture, because we talked about before, if we switch from animal agriculture to plant agriculture, we only need a quarter as much. So a lot of the transition has to be to something that isn't growing food at all. So I don't know what sense you've got about the practicalities of transition across.
I don't have any answers in terms of the practicalities. I've got a lot of ideas around what we should be thinking about and how we should be maybe. So yeah, I think this is one of the first questions I was asking maybe several years ago at a conference, and unfortunately, I've not been able to pursue it much. In any real sense, because I've not found many people who are willing to also get into the detail. So if you've got any suggestions for people to chat with, let me know. Because yeah, I think that we need to recognize, as you're saying, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be painful for communities whose whole identity often is wrapped up in the particular agricultural work that they do. So in Australia, for instance, we have dairy communities. They are predominantly, their economic system is predominantly based around dairy, or has been in the past, and they see themselves as a dairy community.
Yeah, it's the identity, it's the essence of what the community is about.
Yeah. And you take that away from people, people are going to commit suicide. People are going to, push back. And we see it with a industry that doesn't even have that deep, not necessarily that deep connection, although there are communities over in the US for this. When we look at fossil fuels and trying to do just transition, I think these idea of just transition sort of came too late in the conversation in regards to the climate crisis. We should be working towards just transition for the animal agricultural industry and communities, and it includes everything from social support, psychological support for communities that are transitioning, trying to figure out subsidies, exactly. Trying to figure out what jobs people might go into, or whether we can move industry, like create new industries or new opportunities in rural areas. It will mean the collapse of communities. It will. I mean, there will be places that just don't exist anymore, like has happened with other transitions of industries. I think there is so much work to be done. It's like, and it's even like not simple things, but also real practicalities around the supply chain logistics. How does that change when you shift all your agricultural production from out in the hundreds of kilometers from the city where they're growing animals to large breweries, cell-based breweries that are on the edge of a city? I mean, there's great benefits to that. And can you have microbreweries that are out in community? How does that work? I think there's lots and lots and lots of things to think about, and that we need to get thinking. And I think some people are I've certainly had plenty of conversations where people say, yeah, we need to think about this. And I'm just not sure who's doing the work.
I agree. And I think it's coming. I mean, the Vegan Society in the UK have done some interesting work on a report called the Grow Green Report that was written by one of my previous guests, Alex Lockwood. There is some more stuff coming through in the US now, but it's still quite early stage. There are some NGOs like Mercy for Animals and Miyako's Creamery and the Rancher Advocacy Program that are doing. But again, it's tiny micro-scale experiments, really, rather than systemically thinking about how to drive these transitions. So it's a fascinating space.
And I wonder if there's like a frame. I wonder if there's like a some guidance or guidelines that can be developed that these are the things to consider when working through just transition, and things will change with each community. But these are the broad principles and key ideas. Because I think, the problem that I think we're going to face, and I worry about, and will cause many more hundreds of millions, if not billions, of animals to die, is this lag phase between knowing the industry is going to collapse. Because I think we're going to get there with cell ag. I mean, if we can get cheaper meat, I don't see animal agriculture being anything more than niche. For rich people, probably. So if you can, there's going to be a lag phase, and a whole bunch of people are going to push back against the collapse. And we could see, like fossil fuels, we could have 30, or we're in like 40th year of real pushbacks against any sort of real change, and we're going to see it up until 2050s and maybe beyond. And we need to do it way faster than that. But we could see decades and decades of an industry hanging on because they have social license and haven't been supported, or we haven't figured out how to support them through a just transition. And that means billions and billions and billions and billions of animals dying because we haven't done the groundwork, I suppose.
Yeah, agreed. Well, so there's plenty of work to do, but I like the way that you've got ultimately a hopeful outlook grounded on the basic fact that most of the 7.8 billion humans already care about each other and sentient non-humans too, right? And if we can make it easier for people to express that and work through these transition plans and get on with it, there's some hope there.
And yeah, like just as you say that, I think about the and it's because it's so present in the media at the moment, but the horrible things that are happening in Ukraine with the invasion, but people are taking their animal, like they're not just abandoning their cats and dogs and whoever else they live with, they are taking them with them, and they are a priority. And there's even people who are staying, they're staying in this place that could cause their own death so that they can support these animals. We have such rich and deep relationships, and I think I do truly hope and think that is a matter of time that there will be some things that help us supercharge it. And I think cell-based ag will be one of those things, hopefully.
Yeah, I agree. And I'd echo one of your other hopeful comments earlier on, that caring more about non-human animals will enrich the degree to which we care about the environment. And I also think it will enrich the degree to which we care about our fellow humans too. I mean, we're all sentient beings. And I think while some people are so angry about what humanity collectively does to animals that they can come up with a very negative view of other humans, and I can sort of sympathize to a degree, I think once you have that empathy for non-human animals, you can't avoid extending that to human animals too. So I again, it's naive, maybe, but I do think genuinely there's a win-win-win through all of those different levels if we can enhance that central compassion and organize around that and understand the world naturalistically, of course, as opposed to making shit up or believing things other people have made up.
And it does mostly, I think that when you speak to people, they do mostly, like when they start to consider animals, things do expand. Although I have seen cases in the animal activist community where, people are still horrible to other people. So I think it's not a panacea, but it certainly, I think, is a good step towards more people being more thoughtful.
Humans are sentient beings too. We need to remind ourselves of that sometimes.
Mostly,
even the bad ones. Yeah. Well, it's been an absolute inspiration to talk to you. I've taken up a load of your time, and I know it's getting late there as well. But thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thanks so much, Jamie. I love these conversations. So if I could have these all day, then I would. But unfortunately, I've also got to do other work.
Of course, I will let you go on with it. Well, I don't think we've done too bad answering what's real, what matters, and how to make the world a better place. It's not bad for a couple of hours, really. So
we'll have to come back in a year or so and see if we've changed our mind on it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in the meantime, what's the best way of people following you, learning more about your work?
I've just recently gotten off all of the socials, but
I noticed you disappeared from Twitter. Yeah.
It was like I just got a pile on the conservation issue, and I was thinking about it, and I'm like, Twitter doesn't really do much for me. It just stresses me out, and I don't need it. So I'm done.
It's a bit special.
But so the best way to contact me, seriously, if people are interested in contacting me, email me at adam.cardilini@deakin.edu.au. I'm the only Adam Cardilini out there in the world, I'm pretty sure. So it's very easy to find me. And get in touch, send me an email, or you can find the work that I do on Google Scholar or through my university website. But my current research, so I've got things. It's been a slow burn getting to the point where I can actually do research for animals. Prior to that, I've done research against animals and on animals, and it's been horrible. But that was a long time ago, and I'm transitioning away from that. So you might see some things in my publishing list that are pretty terrible, but hey ho, things are shifting.
yeah, absolutely. And Freedom of Species too, of course, which people can subscribe to and listen to on 3CR.
Yep, Freedom of Species. You can get it on Spotify or any other platform. I think we're in our 11th year of a radio show, animal focused, animal activist radio show. One of the early ones.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, so it's still going strong, and definitely check it out. It has great guests like Jamie on there, and many others.
You had to say that, but I can only agree. Well, Adam, thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure, and stay in touch.
No worries. Thanks, Jamie. You have a good one.